On this episode of Militaria at the Museum, we uncover the story of the Royal Canadian Navy hydrofoil prototype, a marvel of naval engineering that pushed the limits of innovation. Next, we examine a powder horn linked to the 1757 Siege of Louisbourg, a vital tool that kept British troops powder dry amid the chaos of battle. Finally, we talk to a retired Voodoo pilot, exploring gripping first-hand accounts from the Cold War era. Beyond museum exhibits lies a hidden realm of archived artifacts that hold the keys to unlocking intriguing stories from the past. Come along as I meet with experts at the Army, Naval, and Aviation museums, where I've been granted special access to pull back the curtains and reveal the secrets of their militaria. My name is Sandy Hiltz, and all my life I've been captivated by military history. Now, I have the rare opportunity to explore a collection of fascinating military artifacts on Militaria at the Museum. Our focus today at the Naval Museum is the Royal Canadian Navy hydrofoil FHE 400, a 1960s prototype of incredible speed. We'll explore how this cutting-edge vessel, developed for anti-submarine warfare, achieved speeds of around 115 kilometers an hour during its trials and before the program was later discontinued. I know that the Canadian government had an extensive hydrofoil program in the 1960s, but I also understand that the history of hydrofoil technology and its experimentation goes back in Canada long before that.
Very much so. Alexander Graham Bell was experimenting with hydrofoils in the early part of the 20th century.
Well, that's very interesting, Rick, because most people would think of Graham Bell as the inventor of the telephone, not someone who was interested in aviation technology.
Well, he had a number of interests in a number of different fields, aviation being one of them, and certainly the telephone. But a lot of his ideas he never carried through to fruition. He would come up with an idea, and then he would rely on other people to work out the petty little details of it.
Right. I had the opportunity to see one of the early hydrofoil prototypes. Can you tell me a little bit about what comes before and after that example?
There are at least 7 different test beds, and what they were looking at was increasing the size of the vessel so they could get up to a warship size. Before they got to that stage, they needed to develop the foils that actually worked properly. Hydrofoil is a seagoing vessel that has a combination of riding on its hull in low speed, and then it will lift up into the air on its wings, which are the foils. The Canadian prototype work, the design was to bring the ship up just to barely pierce the water, so there's almost no friction against the hull. There was a lot of collaboration between the US Navy, the Canadian Navy, and the Royal Navy as well. Their prototypes were surface piercing, but ours was the entire foil above.
Rick, as we were talking about earlier, Alexander Graham Bell was one of the early people involved in hydrofoil technology. What did his version look like?
He actually called them hydrodromes. This was probably the last version of it. And you can see here, it's a very large vessel. It's wood with canvas stretched over top of it. It has 2 aircraft engines. This thing could do 115 kilometers an hour. The problem was the hydrofoils are not the kind of stressable materials that we have today. These ones were primarily wood. So there are a lot of fractures, there was a lot of cavitation, there was a lot of porpoising where the boat goes up and down like this. So it was always running through different designs. Bell's craft here self-propelled, but later on it came under tow. Eventually the whole project was abandoned, and the hydrodrome number 4 was left to rot on the shore of the lake. And the Canadian Navy recovered that and presented it to the Bell Museum, and now Bell Museum does have a reproduction of this hydrofoil.
Our story sort of starts, certainly in Canada at least, with that early version by Graham Bell.
Absolutely.
But then it ends with the Voodoo, doesn't it?
Yes and no. There was another version that came along after the Voodoo that was called the Proteus. And again, it was a test bed for a different kind of foil arrangements. We have some photos of that. The other thing that they were working on was a thing called supercavitation. What happens when these foils lift out of the water is that the propellers, like these things here, but also the foils themselves, are churning up the water and they're producing air bubbles in there. And when they collapse, it can cause enormous amount of damage to the foils and to the propellers themselves. These surfaces here, and they look like they're decorative, but every single one of those is worked out by analog computer so that it minimized that supercavitation and also used the supercavitation to increase the ability of the vessel to move faster. These are basically airplanes. There's greater lift below a wing than there is on top of the wing just because of the shape of the wing. Instead of going through the medium of air, it's going through the medium of water. By changing the blades and changing the hydrofoil shape and arrangement, they were able to change round air bubbles into oblong air bubbles. And
Really?
that created a totally different dynamic for this ship.
Oh, that's fascinating. So they were successful when they were trying to change the technology.
Yes, they were, but it was not a sustainable technology in the sense that they kept running into one kind of a problem after another. They were quite sure that give us a couple more $1 million and we'll fix it. By the time this was finished, it was $54.4 million in 1971 dollars, which is close to 400 million now.
Now, we never really made the transition from these prototypes and testbeds into an actual warship, did we?
No, this piece right here, the 400, was still a test bed. As with any prototype, there's always challenges. The hull of the hydrofoil was aluminum, but the hydrofoil foils were special kinds of metals. They disintegrated with the supercavitation bubbles. They also leaked. And so once the salt water got inside, it destroyed the components in there as well.
So while it wasn't successful in a defense technology setting,
Right.
certainly not in Canada, there is a lasting impact of the research that was being done for this program.
Very much so. You run into the same type of propeller, the same design on submarines particularly. The turbine engine that's used in this, there's variations of it that are used in the current frigates. The weapon systems were used in other Canadian warships, so they weren't lost either. And the kind of technology that they were going to use for their sonar was also used.
And what is the fate of 400 today? Was she scrapped eventually?
No. A lot of the interior materials were taken out and used elsewhere. Eventually, it was put onto a barge and taken up to Quebec, and it's currently open as a museum.
It's particularly interesting to see how many of the technologies that were developed along the way have still persisted.
Yes, that's very true. I also like the evolution from the initial stages of HD4 to this. It's totally different.
Oh, absolutely. It's quite something to see the changes that they made along the way and how ingenious many of the design changes
Very much so,
were.
yeah. There were a lot of people that worked on this.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much.
You're very welcome. There is nothing that's developed without failures. All successes are based on failures. You can't toss a project simply because it didn't work the first time. Alexander Graham Bell knew that when he developed one after the other of the hydrodromes, and he left that technology for other engineering types, and he went on to a new business.
After the break, I'll hear the little-known stories behind a powder horn from 1757, uncovering how its artistry gives us clues into its past. At the Army Museum, we're exploring the history and artistry of the powder horn. These essential vessels were used by soldiers to carry gunpowder during the colonial period. Crafted from cow horn and often intricately engraved, each powder horn was unique, combining practicality with personal expression. You have a uniquely North American art form to show me.
Yes, this is a engraved powder horn dated Halifax, 1757. Now, this powder horn illustrates the elements of the events that are happening here in Halifax in the summer of 1757. And to my knowledge at this point, this is the only 7 Years' War horn or engraved horn in the provincial style.
Oh, I can't wait to see it.
Okay, let's go have a look.
The first purpose of this is, of course, not to be beautiful, but to be functional. What would be the use of a powder horn at the time, Kevin?
Powder horns are something you'd find in almost every household in what we'd call colonial North America in the 18th and 19th century, prior to the introduction of modern cartridge ammunition and whatnot. Majority hunting weapons and military arms that you'd see all over the world use black powder. So a powder horn could be made from, again, like a slaughtered animal, or something as a piece of art, like our 1757 horn. So it's both utilitarian and, again, by the time of the 7 Years' War, is developing into what's known as a provincial art form. A powder horn this size could hold the better part of a pound, which is about 80 rounds or charges for a powder horn. So all members of, say, New England militia would be expected, and this continues on into the American Revolution, to, if on a call-up, you bring a shot bag, powder horn or a cartridge box, a musket, an axe, etc. This horn, though, is rather special in the fact that it has these engravings on it.
Tell me a bit more about the carving of powder horns as an art form.
This style in the 7 Years' War is evolving out of the sort of almost folk art style of engravings that you'd be seeing in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, some parts of New York. By the 7 Years' War, though, you're moving into a more highly skilled aspect of engraving. This shows that this was probably done by an engraver, or it could have been done by the owner themselves, and recording events, places that the individual is around or part of. They record historical events and areas of operation that specifically North American troops are serving in.
Looking at this, Kevin, it appears as if it would require some very fine tools to be doing this work.
This, again, with the fine lines, the detail that's been here, this would show someone that has some actual engraving tools. There are at least 3 well-known engravers who are producing these things during the time of the 7 Years' War. It says here, again, his horn made July, Halifax, 1757. So again, in July of 1757, the expedition that's supposed to go to Louisbourg, the battle group, the fleet that's here, by July, the city of Halifax is full of British naval personnel and British infantry, gunners, etc. Very possible that you had one of these engravers, who is almost like a sutler or someone who's attached to the army, is present in the city. On the other side of the horn, we can see some of the elements of the summer's events with the engraving of ships of the line. Okay, by July, there are 11 men of war here in Halifax, 50 transports for troops. That's some like 4,000 naval personnel. There are close to 14,000 British infantry, New England troops here as well. And the city is just overrun with elements of this task force that is supposed to take Louisbourg. We can see sort of what is quite possibly St. Paul's Church, overlapping with Mather's Church, a building, or maybe one of the buildings on Citadel Hill or Barrack. Along here as well, we can see like a table set up where British troops are feasting or having a dinner. Here, this is what's known as a pennant or a wimple that is often used on ships of the line back in the 18th and 19th century. If you look into the history of engraving, not just powder horns, but other objects, it's not uncommon for sometimes things to have more than one pass of an engraver's hand. Maybe in 1757, we have the engraver putting on like these very nice floral motifs on here with the date, but this looks a little more at times almost like a second hand has passed over this as well, right?
And it's even a bit more crude in a way.
It is, and that's not uncommon for someone to make a second edition onto something within the world of engraving, whether it's powder horns or plate or whatever, right?
This would be later, the silver mount.
Exactly. This was passed down as an heirloom piece. So originally the plug would have been made of wood. The spout would have had like a bone or wood stopper, and this would have been basically hung with a strap. And this is all done well after this is being used as a functioning powder horn and has become an heirloom piece and a souvenir and a remembrance of that summer of 1757, a huge turning point in the city.
Kevin, this picture here, is this sort of a view of Halifax that the owner of this powder horn would have been seeing at the time?
Exactly. So if we look at this, this is a copy of one of the paintings that Dominic Serres Sr. does of the Halifax landscape. and this was done in 1762. So this is a view from the slope of the first citadel. This is St. Paul's, this is Mather's Church. The artist depicts it as if you're looking face on, but again, here it is in profile. And so from an angle, these look like they're almost directly behind each other. Halifax won't be a city until, 1839, so it's still very much the town of Halifax. And you can see the different types of ships that are here in the harbor are reflected by what's on the Powderhorn. And these are all things that you would see in the city if you lived here, or if you were part of that task force. It is kind of a visual record of that year, kind of like a little moment in time, if you would.
And one of the details that I notice here is that this is early enough in the city's history, this depiction, that there's still the log wall around parts of the city. Yeah.
This is still part of the original palisade trace. You can also see over here the ground has been cut for firewood and for building materials. The artist is somewhat confined by the space on the horn, but he's got a lot of information on here.
Kevin, thank you so much for showing this to me. It's been a real pleasure, and it's been a very interesting opportunity to look back at the history of powderhorns and the way throughout time that they have been such a combination of beauty and functionality.
Yes, very much so. And this belongs to and in the collection of the Nova Scotia Museum. So I'd like to give a shout out to the registrar of the Nova Scotia Museum, Lisa Bauer, who very quickly facilitated us being able to use that and to present here today.
After the break, I'll be at the Aviation Museum to dive into the history of the CF-101 Voodoo, a supersonic jet that played a vital role in protecting North American skies. At the Aviation Museum, I'm meeting with a former Royal Canadian Air Force pilot who flew a CF-101 Voodoo during the Cold War. This supersonic jet interceptor was a critical tool in the Air Force's arsenal for protecting Canadian airspace. Mark, what can you tell me about Jim Thompson?
Well, Jim Thompson is an ex-RCF jet fighter pilot who flew CF-101s throughout the 60s, 70s, and he's a museum member today, and he's going to tell us about his career and his story.
Oh, that sounds great.
Jim Thompson is an ex-CF-101 Voodoo pilot who flew with 416 Squadron and actually flew the Voodoo we have on display here.
We, of course, have your logbook here, and I'm excited to get into that. But tell me, how did you first get interested in flying?
Well, according to my mother, from a very early age. And as a teenager, growing up in Calgary, I spent a lot of time at the Calgary airport, sitting in old harbors and cancels and that sort of thing, not knowing what I was going to do, but I said, I do want to be a pilot. So I went down to the recruiting office. He said, well, you're a smart young lad, why don't you go to military college first? From there, went to basic flying training in Gimli on the CT-114 Tudor. And following that, on the T-33 for advanced training, and a year later, got my wings. My first career path was as being a flying instructor myself in Moose Jaw.
And the next path in your career takes you actually to the front lines.
Yeah, I went through Winnipeg in flying standards for a year, and following that in 1971, I went to the Voodoo OTU in Bagotville for 4 months, and then I was posted to CFB Chatham and the big beast of a Voodoo.
The CF-101 Voodoo was a two-seat, all-weather interceptor that the Canadian Air Force flew early 1960s right through to 1984 and used exclusively in North America as part of the NORAD defense system. So what sort of training did they put you in before you got into the Voodoo?
They put you in the back seat for the first flight. I couldn't believe how quick that airplane was. It was a monster. And the second flight, I was in the front seat, the instructor in the back. And from there, there's a structured training program of some basic things like formation flying and instrument flying, and then you get into the tactical stuff. During the course, we were all paired, pilot and navigators, but they were really the radar operators in the rear seat. You very quickly developed a real good relationship. We had our own call shot exercises every year, inter-squadron, and the winning squadron would go to William Tell in the States.
The CF-101 Voodoo crews were annually in contest with the United States Air Defense crews as well. And it was called the William Tell Contest. And it was basically a marksmanship and a mission capability test. And this was the sort of ultimate part that Voodoos were used in that became basically Canada's version of Top Gun. So, Jim, did you actually fire any live missile fires?
I didn't myself, and we didn't on call shop, but in William Tell, they actually did fire inert Air 2As.
I'm interested in the technology behind the Voodoo. What can you tell me about it?
It was designed as an all-weather interceptor. In 1957, I believe it held the world speed record of 1,200 miles an hour. And it could go from ground to 36,000 feet in less than a minute.
Oh my goodness.
It had an onboard radar, and it had an infrared capability as well. So we had a capability of tracking targets with the aircraft radar, locking on and firing missiles at them, or we could go for the heat source from behind. We were guided to the targets by the NORAD control center, and they had what we called SAGE, a semi-automated ground environment system. They would tell us we've got a target, give us a bearing to start with. Pilot in the front seat would start talking to the navigator, we're this altitude, this airspeed, I'm heading this way, and he would start talking, saying, I think I've got a contact here. And once the navigator in the back seat did make the contact, he would tell NORAD, I've got it, we're taking control of the intercept. The weapons we used, the Air 2A Genie, had a nuclear warhead. It was about a 6-mile range and Mach 3, so it got to the target in just over 8 seconds. And it didn't have to be too close for that nuclear warhead. The infrared missiles, of course, the AIM-4D, built by Hughes, unfortunately, it didn't have a proximity fuse. It had to actually hit the target. So if we were attacking, we'd come up from behind as close as we could. And once we got a very strong tone, which meant you've got the target, send it off.
So it was a hugely collaborative process.
Yes, yes it was.
Now I'm really excited to have a look inside the logbook. Can you take us through some of the highlights?
Oh, I certainly will. Every flight over a 19-year period, basically who I flew with, the aircraft type, the aircraft number, and logging the hours under various categories. This is the graduating class of 101 pilots and navigators from the school in Bagotville.
Now, where are you in this photo?
I'm sort of third from the left.
And are you each standing beside your navigators?
Yes.
Is that the way it is?
Yes.
Right, right.
During one of the summers in Shearwater, we were doing a 4-plane formation practice, and the wingman who was maneuvering around past me happened to clip my wing. It tore it up pretty badly. Fortunately, the aileron stayed put, so the aircraft was controllable and got it back safely. 2 weeks later, a fisherman delivered the piece. It had come up in his trawl, his fish net. So it's pretty interesting. I have a map here. That was what I used to navigate low level. And this happens to be the Grand Canyon. And you see the line goes through it. I actually flew in the Grand Canyon. All the points along the way are easily identifiable, whether it's rivers or hills. The final flight I flew was actually a graduation trip for one of the students. And the student had to plan the mission, brief me, and then lead me, and I flew on his wing. You know, I'm basically assessing how he's doing all the way through. But the mission was to fly and bomb an enemy pillbox on an island in the middle of a lake. And we hit it. And then the second target was a Warsaw Pact airfield, and there were some plywood aircraft there, and we cannoned it to death, and then returned home. That was a great way to end a flying career and a pilot career.
So it was quite a successful last flight by the sound.
Yes, it was. It couldn't have been any better. My own airplane with weapons.
Jim, thank you so much for taking me through your career. It's been fascinating to be able to flip through the pages of your log and see your 19 years in the sky.
Yes, well, that brought back a lot of memories.
I think it stands testament that Jim is able to share his stories with us today and adds a whole new context to our exhibit.
Having special access to go beyond museum exhibits reveals some of history's best-kept secrets and most interesting stories. Thank you for joining me in this exploration of military artifacts on another episode of Militaria at the museum.